Next paper is Risk Characteristics, Mental Models, and Perception of Security Risks. The speaker is
Vaibhav Garg.
Vaibhav.
So hopefully everyone can hear me. So the title of the talk is Risk Characteristics, Mental Models, and Perceptions of Security Risk. My name is Vaibhav Garg. This is joint work with my PhD advisor, Gene Camp. I don't think Gene is here, so I'll be fending all the questions. So a predominant kind of accepted wisdom in security is that people don't take secure actions because people don't care about security. And one of these arguments is, so someone in the morning presented a paper on spam bots. And basically, if you get a piece of spam and you click on, some of the links in the spam email, you might infect your computer. The malware might not do anything to your computer specifically, but it could be used as a part of a botnet to attack other computers or, conduct a denial of service attack against someone else. So as long as, the malware doesn't impact you, you, rationally speaking, shouldn't care about that piece of malware, right? And so that's kind of the argument that is presented in the paper by Ross and Tyler. That's the rational economics argument, right? If there's no loss occurring to me, why should I defend against it, right? The behavioral behavioral economics argument is that investment in security is a certain loss, right? While leaving your computer open and, assuming that there may or may not be an attack, so that's a probable loss. And this is something, so it's a established behavioral economics finding that, people, when faced with a probable loss, a larger probable loss or a smaller certain loss, people tend to go for the larger probable loss. So if you think about how many of you here have flood insurance? Do you guys have floods? Where do you guys come from? Okay. But in large parts of the United States, flooding is a big problem. And in the 70s and in the 80s, the US government tried to come up with many different techniques to get people to buy flood insurance. And people wouldn't, right? Mostly because, buying flood insurance, is $500 worth of money, which you have to pay right now. And so right now you're losing $500 worth of money. Versus you may or may not have all your house and all your property get destroyed by a flood at an abstract point in time in the future, right? So that's probable loss, and people chose to take the probable loss of losing all their material goods and things that they owned, rather than go for the certain loss of that $500, right? But so this is sort of an accepted thing that people don't care about security, and people don't want to invest in security, and so they don't want to buy antivirus, they don't want to buy other tools and things like that. But this is obviously not true. How many of you have seen this pop-up or a pop-up like this? So you're browsing the internet and you get a pop-up which says that your computer has been infected. Please click here to clear your computer of all malware. Have you guys seen this? Have you guys clicked on it? Well, I was young. I was 17. Come on. So you get something like this, and you click on it, and so this is called fake anti-malware, fake AV. So this is a very large scam. So Ross Anderson et al. I keep calling it Ross. Sorry, Anderson et al. Came up with. They sort of estimated, how much money do people lose by clicking on these things? So, this is going to be like a financial estimate of how much people care about protecting their security. And this scam costs around $97 million. So that was the global estimate for, that is the amount of money people lost by clicking on things like these between 2008 and 2010. So that's a huge amount of money. So, people are actually willing to protect their information, and people are happily willing to invest in security. It's just the things that people do are not necessarily the things that are most effective. So people choose, very simple password, like password or 123456, or any of those arbitrary, comically bad passwords that you've heard at other password-related talks. But if you see someone, trying to enter their password at an airport lounge, presuming a lot of you flew in to come to this conference, you'll see people try to hide their password, right? Like people defend against shoulder surfing attacks, right? But that's really not the attack that they should be defending against. So the question is, what are security things that people defend against, and what are the security things that people care about, and how do they determine that these are the things that are more scary, and how do they determine these are the things that are not that scary? So my advice is, it would be so much easier if Jean was here. Jean likes to go scuba diving, and she tried to get me to go scuba diving with her. And I was like, well, why do you want to go scuba diving? So well, she said, well, there's lots of nice sharks that you can look at. And I said, I don't know if you've seen the movie Jaws, but they're not all that nice. And admittedly, only 5 people ever die of shark-related attacks every year. I had a much higher likelihood of dying on the way to the conference, just based on the number of people who die crossing the street in a regular accident. So I shouldn't care about these things, but I do. So the question is, how do people determine things that they should care about? What do people defend against? And so that was the purpose of the study. We wanted to figure out, how do people determine that these security risks are more scary than some of these other security risks? So, well, we tried to figure out, what can be some of these variables that decide that. And so for that, we looked at the literature. So this is one of the canonical studies, how safe is safe enough? And they said, well, people decide whether something is risky or not based on the characteristics of the risk. So I'll run through a few of these. So for example, voluntariness. Do you do something voluntarily or not? So we talk a lot about, sharing information with the US government, right? And how the US government is spying over everyone. But at the same time, we go ahead and provide that same information on Facebook all the time. So whether you're doing something voluntarily or not has a huge impact, right? Immediacy. So if you engage in a risky activity, does it impact you now, or does it impact you 50 years later? So I will pick a lot on smokers in this talk, but I think that's legitimate because I used to smoke for 8 years. Both my parents are doctors. I very much understand how smoking is bad for me. How many smokers? Any smokers at all? One person? Okay. Well, most smokers would happily do the activity on the right? I'll go have a cigarette. But I think even the most hardcore smokers will, I don't have to say it, right? So any engineers, because last time I gave this talk, there was an engineer and he said the throughput would still be the same. Don't destroy my example. But basically the idea is when you smoke, you have a cigarette one at a time, you don't really feel the impact till you are 50, right, when you're dying of lung cancer. Versus in the first case, that gentleman would probably feel the effects quite quickly. How much control do you have on the activity? So I'm terrified of flying. I drove here from DC. It was an 8-hour drive with lots of construction on the highway. So it wasn't particularly pleasant, but I prefer driving over flying, right? And I think it's reasonable to say that most people do. And to an extent, there's a sense of control which gives you comfort. When I'm driving and I see my car crashing into something, I see myself doing this very Matrix Neo style roll out of the car, where I roll out on the street and I'm perfectly fine. When I see the airplane crashing, all I see is the airplane dividing into 2 segments and me falling for those 30 seconds, right? Or how much time it takes to fall to the ground. And that's really what terrifies me. So I have no control. If an airplane explodes in the middle of the sky, there's nothing I can do. I will die. I cannot control it. Newness, one of these is a coal power plant, one of these is a nuclear power plant. Depending on which country you come from, one of these is more acceptable to you than the other. In the United States, everyone hates nuclear power plants, and everyone is kind of okay with coal power plants, even though if you live next to a coal power plant, you experience way more radiation than if than from a nuclear power plant, right? And part of this is, nuclear energy is considered to be, by the way, I'm not advocating one form of energy over the other. I'm just saying that, part of where the fear about nuclear energy comes from is because it's seen as something new that we don't know as much about, and that needs to be tested before we deploy it. I've already talked about severity, right? So everyone's scared of shark attacks. How many people are afraid of these? So 5 people die from shark attacks every year. 500 people die falling out of the bed. Fair enough, but
6 months.
all right. But the idea is, we are afraid of things that we shouldn't be afraid of, and we are not afraid of things that we should be afraid of. So characteristics of the risk matter a lot. Another thing that matters is mental models. So one of the things that is always, every time you buy a pack of cigarettes, it says smoking kills. Is that really why we shouldn't smoke? Because smoking kills? Because everyone in this room is going to die. I know, I'm a very optimistic, pleasant, upbeat presenter. But everyone in this room is going to die, right? That's really not the problem. The problem is the fact that you're going to die a lot sooner than you expected to, right? And the quality of life in the last 20 years where you're just going to be like the entire time is not going to be that great, right? But that's not the kind of information that you get on your pack of cigarettes, right? The pack of cigarettes just says smoking kills. So it's a very kind of mental model that, the mental model that is being used for communication is very different from the reality of what is happening. So in security risk communication, there are 5 kind of mental models that we use. So, the first is medical, so, viruses and things like that. The other is criminal, so identity theft, physical, clickjacking, system penetration. So there are all these different kind of mental models, and they frame how risky or not risky do we perceive some security risk to be. So those were 2 of the predominant things that we wanted to see. How do characteristics of the risk explain the mental models of perceived risk? So our method was, so there are 2 ways to evaluate this. One is called express preferences. The other is called revealed preferences. Express preferences, you ask people what, how risky something is. In revealed preferences, you looked at people's past behaviors or what they've done in the past. I don't have access, as a PhD student, I definitely did not have access to a huge database of people's security behaviors. If any one of you does, I'll be happy to talk to you afterwards. So the easiest thing for me to do was ask people how they would, how scary or not scary do they find certain security activities to be. So I did a survey. Amazon's Mechanical Turk was an easy, cheap way of doing this, where I won't just get, everyone who's a college student between the age of 18 and 24. So I did that, and we had 332 participants. They were all paid around $2. This survey took somewhere between 30 to 45 minutes to complete. So I'm just going to quickly run through some of the findings. So we found that risks that were rated as, people thought were rare, had catastrophic consequences, and had very severe consequences were the ones that people found to be more scary. So, well, I know a lot of people in this room are kind of really young, but I think everyone remembers Y2K. And if you remember at that point in time, there was huge media publicity around how if we don't solve the Y2K problem, everything will come crashing. At least the news stories that I read. So there was a huge change, right? People tried to update their computers, as fast as they could figure out a solution. They implemented that solution. So if you have enough media publicity, it is possible to get people to change behaviors, right? And that's the idea here. If you make it, scary enough, if you convey that the severity of consequences is very high, that it's going to impact a lot of people, and this is a rare thing. This is a once-in-a-lifetime event, right? Y2K happened once. This thing will not happen till we again, hit the, the limit on the counter. This is probably not going to happen for a while, right? The other thing that we saw that for the medical mental model, in addition to the severity, rarity, and catastrophic nature of consequences, another thing that really mattered was control. So a lot of people install antivirus software on their system, and the way antivirus companies advertise their software is to say that, you get what you pay for. So there's this notion that you can control whether you're going to get malware infection on your computer or not by buying the best antivirus software, right? But that's obviously not true. No antivirus software catches every strain of malware that is out there, right? Even the best antivirus software, maybe like, depending upon which company you ask, somewhere between 50 to 75% or 85% effective, right? So at the end of the day, you still have to be cognizant of good browsing behaviors, right? You still have to avoid quote unquote bad websites so that you don't get malware infections or bad security practices. So if you wanted people to not get virus infections, you want to, when you're designing risk communication, you want to focus on the fact that no security systems are effective to 100%. I have 2 more slides. I'm good. Thanks. For the criminal mental model, we found that voluntariness mattered a lot. So if people thought that something was voluntary, it was perceived to be less risky. So identity theft was perceived to be very risky, which was largely seen as an involuntary activity, versus phishing, which is a vector for identity theft, was perceived as not risky because it was perceived as a voluntary activity. Did I say voluntary both times? So identity theft was perceived as involuntary and it was seen as very risky, versus phishing, which is a vector for identity theft, was perceived as not so risky because it's a voluntary activity. So here, if you were going to design risk communication, you want to focus on the expected value of loss. And you want to talk about, irrespective of whether it's a voluntary thing or it's an involuntary thing, you're still going to lose the same amount of money, right? So I'm going to skip this slide, but this is, again, for the warfare mental model, we again found that, voluntariness mattered a lot in addition to the 3 key characteristics. This is something that I just wanted to include it very quickly. I found this, I got this thing on my computer while I was preparing the talk. I have never received an update from Microsoft that didn't say that it was critical. And I think this is a huge problem. I think we talk about how people don't take security actions, but we have created a warning fatigue by constantly telling people that everything is the end of the world. And they constantly have to, they are constantly expected to take action now and do something now. So it's really important to kind of, prioritize what people need to do and give them actual guidance on what they should be doing. If you have any questions, please tell me now.
Very nice presentation. Thank you.
Thank you.